Hey everyone, and welcome back to your Linux and open source news show. As you might be able to hear, my voice is a bit cracked. I'm in the process of getting sick. I know myself, it's gonna be a big case of the man flu, so bear with me during this episode. This week, we've got a few interesting things. First, the first steps towards a Google breakup as the DOJ in the United States asks for Google to have to sell Chrome away. We also have a continuation of the bcacheFS drama as the developer behind this file system cannot help themselves, just cannot be civil and a normal human being, and now is in violation of the Linux kernel's code of conduct. We also have ReiserFS being deleted from the kernel, and it's a nice parallel with what bcacheFS is currently going through. And we also have potential leaks and data mined information about the Steam controller too. And we also have this message from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, your all-in-one platform to create, manage, and publish your own website. Squarespace has really easy tools to make sure anyone can end up with a nice-looking, well-optimized website, no matter if they know how to code or not. They have what they call their blueprint system, which lets you pick from a variety of templates that are pre-built and will suit any type of website, whether it's a simple blog, an online store, a video platform, whatever. On top of that, to go further, Squarespace has their own design engine to create your own pages. You can just drag and drop elements where you want them, and you can change the colors, the fonts, and just tweak the template however you want. And once you have something you like, you can add extra features like creating your own online shop, complete with a payment system that handles credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and more. So check out squarespace.com/thelinuxexperiment, the link is in the description, so you can give Squarespace a shot, and you'll also get 10% off your first website or domain name purchase. Okay, so after the recent rulings in the US stating that Google is in fact a monopoly in terms of search, which will probably come as no surprise to literally anyone, it looks like the Department of Justice is indeed looking at breaking up Google. It had been talked about, but most people seem to say it would be a last resort. Turns out, the DOJ has finalized their request to the judge, and at the top of the list of what they'd like the courts to order is forcing Google to sell Chrome, because it's a key access point through which people access search engines. And as such, it can't be left under the same umbrella as all other Google products because it clearly stifles competition. Of course, this poses a lot of questions. How would you ensure Chrome wouldn't just default to Google anyway, through a similar contract as the one Google has with Mozilla? That would absolutely be legal. How many people would still work on Chromium? Would Google employees still be allowed to do so? It's a weird edge case of open source versus pure software ownership. Google stated that selling Android or Chrome would break those businesses, which, in my opinion, is the indication that something isn't right with these businesses, because if they cannot stand on their own two legs, they probably shouldn't be allowed to function as they are. Now, if you think this recommendation from the DOJ is harsh, it's apparently lighter than what they wanted to do, which also included selling Android. Other recommendations include uncoupling Android from all other Google products, so basically allowing any manufacturer to access any Google service on an individual basis, not by having to default to all Google services. Another recommendation is forcing Google to license Google search data and results, which I thought they already did because you already have search engines that use Google's data like Startpage. The DOJ also said that Google should let websites be indexed by Google on the search engine while also refusing to be used to train Google's AI, which sounds more than reasonable. Now, the hearing is planned for April 2025, and by that point, the administration of the US government will have changed, so there's no telling if this will still be pursued as an option, breaking up Google, or if things will change. No one can really tell right now, but what's sure is that if Google is broken up, it's gonna be pretty interesting to see how the web reacts, how the internet works when Google is no longer the huge monopolistic company that manages the most used search engine, the most used web browser, and the most used ad network. Now, you might remember bcacheFS, the in-development, very promising file system that had Linus Torvalds ranting every few months because the developers tried to submit giant patches and fixes outside of the normal development cycles. Well, the saga continued. As proposed, changes are apparently on hold due to the kernel's Code of Conduct board. The main developer for this file system, Kent Overstreet, said that the future of bcacheFS in the Linux kernel is currently uncertain. The current 6.13 pull request made by this developer has been denied due to an open issue with the Code of Conduct board. And he says he doesn't know what is going on, which is obviously not true, because first, he was already warned multiple times by Torvalds and other kernel developers as he tried to bypass the usual kernel development processes. There are also a few threads that portray him as a particularly unpleasant individual in how he interacted with others, asking someone to get their head checked and to, I quote, "get the F out of here with this shit," which is a totally normal and acceptable interaction when talking about code, of course. Now, since the Code of Conduct requires a public apology on the kernel mailing list for this kind of behavior, and Kent seemed unwilling to do so, he very well knows what the issue is, and he's being disingenuous in his own post where he says he doesn't know what is happening. Kent then went on a rant against codes of conduct, accusing the leaders of communities to abuse the power of code of conduct, that power was wielded in uncomfortable ways, and that this is all to avoid having hard technical discussions. Now, reading the actual Linux kernel mailing thread, you'll be able to make up your own mind about how things went, but basically, the guy seems to be moving the goalposts, saying he shouldn't have to apologize because other people were also mean to him at some point. Other maintainers chimed in, even people who think the public apology is too much to ask and non-productive, which I agree with, it's a weird thing to ask for. If matters are resolved, at least, this shouldn't be needed, but even the people who thought this was too much condemned Kent's tone and what he did. Also, reading further into it, it looks like Overstreet tried to push a technical solution hidden in another pull request, after this solution was discussed and judged non-suitable in the code review process. Basically, he ignored the code review and the feedback, and he decided to push whatever he wanted in a hidden fashion, which is obviously not acceptable behavior. In short, it is the usual, I'm too skilled to follow your rules, they shouldn't apply to me, and I can tell anyone off if I want to without any consequences, which is never how things have worked in any community whatsoever. It has nothing to do with having a code of conduct or the code of conduct being too far-reaching. It's a matter of behaving improperly with others. This behavior would be unacceptable in any project or in any public space face-to-face. And obviously, this always turns into, I'm the victim, I'm a genius with bad social skills, which is the most beta way to try and escape such a situation like this. As always, codes of conduct wouldn't be needed if these kinds of people just learn to behave like normal human beings. And if you've been around Linux for a while, this situation might remind you of something: ReiserFS. This file system has finally been deleted from the Linux kernel. This was developed by Hans Reiser a long while ago, 23 years ago to be precise. It was added in the kernel version 2.4.1. Hans remained the main developer and maintainer of this file system for a while, then he stopped contributing and started managing the project until he was found guilty of murder on the person of his wife. He's still serving his sentence today, and understandably, work on his file system has dwindled over the years. Reiser was also known for being a relatively bad actor inside of the Linux community. He made statements like saying that the general kernel developer isn't very bright, questioning the motives of anyone who had any criticism about his code or his file system, instead of actually answering the issues listed. He even went as far as adding some petty personal grievances in the README file of the file system's code, something he asked to be removed earlier this year, saying it was time to let go. And Reiser actually apologized for his behavior towards the Linux kernel community in 2023. ReiserFS was slowly abandoned, being deprecated in 2022 and planned for removal in 2025. And in the kernel 6.13, it will finally be plucked out. And I will end this topic and make the link with bcacheFS here by quoting something Jonathan Cordat said in 2008 for the website lwn.net about ReiserFS and Hans Reiser. I quote, "A number of developers reached a point where they simply chose not to engage with him anymore. By rejecting the development community, Mr. Reiser remained forever an outsider to it. And that is why the practical effects of Mr. Reiser's conviction on the community will be relatively small, at least in the short term. As brilliant as he is, his effectiveness was limited by his disregard for the rest of the community and his certainty of always being right. He could have accomplished much more with a different approach." End quote. And if that quote doesn't absolutely echo what the developer of bcacheFS is doing, codes of conduct or not, then I don't know what is needed to hammer into the heads of people that it's a ego and developer problem, not a code of conduct problem at all. Now we have some interesting news for gamers potentially, as Valve is reportedly working on a Steam Controller 2 and a new VR controller as well, both of which could be indicative of other new hardware to come. The new controller is codenamed Ibex, a name that brings back memories of old Ubuntu versions and coffee-stained wallpapers, and the VR controller is codenamed Roy, which only evokes Ted Lasso to me for some reason. Apparently, both controllers are being tooled for mass production in factories and are in later stages of production. The VR controller specifically appears in Steam VR code and apparently will come with a D-pad, bumpers, triggers, and an ABXY button layout. There's also an unreleased OpenXR extension for this controller, so this one seems pretty much confirmed. No such data mined info exists for the Steam Controller 2. The YouTuber who reported on that hardware seems to think it will have symmetrical sticks, so no longer one stick and a touchpad like the first Steam Controller had. But as always, until it's official, it might as well not exist. Now this is interesting in two ways. First, a new VR controller absolutely means there's gonna be a new VR headset. You don't just build a VR controller without accompanying hardware, so that pretty much confirms that Project Deckard is something that's going to happen. Whether it's a standalone ARM-based headset or not remains to be seen. And as per the Steam Controller 2, my hopium-filled body really wants it to be the indication of a Steam console, like a new Steam machine made by Valve, made for the living room, but it's probably just a controller that anyone will be able to use. Now, the Linux kernel 6.12 is now out. The big thing it brings is the addition of real-time preemption in the mainline kernel, meaning real-time applications should perform much better as high-priority tasks can now interrupt certain lower priority kernel tasks to complete what they have to do first. This is a feature that was proposed back in 2005 and only landed now, as a lot of work was needed to make it work. It's available for 32 and 64-bit x86 systems, for 64-bit ARM, and for RISC-V. There is also in that new version some work done on scheduling, and it apparently makes it possible to build specialized schedulers for certain types of programs. For example, things that could deliver better frame rates for games. On top of that, there's some file system work. There's a new method that should alleviate the performance losses due to Spectre mitigations. The kernel panics can now display QR codes even when the direct rendering manager dies, for example with a big GPU driver crash. There's more RISC-V support, better performance for AMD and Intel hybrid CPUs, and support for more gaming handhelds. Wacom tablets gained high-resolution scrolling, better touch integration, and more, and the Snapdragon support continued for laptops as well. Rust integration also moved forward with more Rust modules available. Solid update to the kernel. As always, wait for your distro to distribute it because they tend to add patches to the mainline kernel, so you might lose support for certain things that your distro already supports if you install a vanilla version of the kernel from a third-party repo. I'm specifically interested in the new BFP or BPF scheduler, which is the thing that lets various developers basically create and optimize the scheduler on the fly, meaning you could have the scheduler be optimized for a 4-threaded game, a game that only runs on 4 threads and not more, and then when you return to something else, you could return to the default normal scheduler. I think it's very interesting in terms of approach, and if I understand it properly, this opens a lot of doors for developers. Still on the topic of drivers, following the problem last week with a kernel developer wanting to silo off Tuxedo drivers because they were written with GPLv3, not GPLv2, and they incorrectly reported that they were compatible with GPLv2, Tuxedo has managed to relicense all the drivers that they were the sole contributors to into GPLv2. For these, there had been no external contributions, so they didn't have to wait for all drivers to be legally safe to relicense them, and they moved all they could to the GPLv2. This includes some NVIDIA power control related things, some Wi-Fi drivers, and a few others. The other drivers, though, will take longer because they need to get the permission from every other contributor to relicense their code. They contributed it under a specific license, and so they need to sign off on any license change. Werner Sambach from Tuxedo wrote in the kernel mailing list that they changed all they could as soon as they could to prove their good faith, and he hopes that the rest can be sorted out as well before anything gets merged, so all drivers could be treated as a single request. Now, once again, this could have been avoided by just normally communicating instead of automatically assuming malice and bad behavior, but in the end, the kernel developer behavior, while it was a bit extreme in my opinion, managed to get Tuxedo to relicense drivers earlier than they would have done if they had had to wait to relicense every driver that they own, which is a good thing, I guess. Now, they warned that their code wasn't necessarily up to Linux kernel upstream standards, so we're gonna have to wait and see if this can be merged or if it has to be rewritten anyway, because it's not up to par. Now, let's talk about some Linux adjacent stuff, specifically ChromeOS. It looks like Google wants to bridge the gap between Android and ChromeOS, at least for tablets. And Google is now looking at turning ChromeOS into Android in a multi-year project to rethink their entire OS strategy. It's not even merging the two operating systems into one, it's just basically removing ChromeOS, migrating ChromeOS devices to Android, and adding the missing features from ChromeOS into Android to make sure the transition works well. So Chromebooks, Chromeboxes, and Chrome tablets would no longer run ChromeOS, but they would run Android in a tweaked and modified version that is more at ease on bigger screens. Google had previously said that ChromeOS would already embrace portions of the Android stack, like the Android Linux kernel and the Android frameworks, and they've been building a terminal that can run Linux apps on Android. Android is also evolving to add better multi-window handling, better keyboard and mouse support, better multi-monitor and external display support, and a lot of things that ChromeOS did well, but that Android is not necessarily good at. And I do not like this transition, because while I would never use vanilla Android with Google baked in or ChromeOS because it's like the worst desktop operating system I've ever used, period, it's still closer to a Linux distro than Android. ChromeOS basically was starting to rebase itself on the normal Linux stack. It was Gen 2, they used normal Mesa drivers at some point, they used a normal Linux version of Google Chrome, and this meant that if Google continued in this way, they would embrace the normal Linux desktop stack and probably contribute to it to make it better. So I think this move is bad for Linux in general, because instead of having cool contributions to our desktop stack, we're gonna have more Google work on Android, which is not helpful for any other Linux user. And let's conclude this video on this message from our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. They make laptops and desktops that ship with Linux pre-installed. As we've discussed in this exact episode, they are doing some work to make sure that their drivers are fully upstreamable and can be linked in the Linux kernel and shipped and used by anyone, but in the meantime, they have modules that they provide in their repos, and a lot of distros have third-party repos that bring those drivers as well, and a lot of their computers just do not need those extra drivers. They're just supported fine by the mainline Linux kernel. I only only use Tuxedo computers these days. I run this entire channel, all my podcast, everything on one of their laptops. I do all my gaming on one of their desktops. I haven't even replugged my PS5 since I moved in this new flat. So if you need a new computer, if you want to run Linux on it, if you want to support a company that contributes to Linux, click the link in the description of the video and check out Tuxedo computers. In the meantime, thank you all for watching. You know what to do for this video to climb in the algorithm, all the usual buttons, comment section, whatever. You know how things work. You know how to turn on the notification bell, right, to get actual notifications and just see the videos. You know how things work. And if you want to support the channel, you know where the links are. It's always in the same place. Thank you all for watching, thank you all for listening if you didn't watch, because that's most of you, and I guess you will hear me in the next one next week. Bye!